There we go. Okay, so this is maybe in stark contrast to the preceding talk. This is mostly math, but I want to try to make this as intelligible as possible. And what this is about is tools for inference in the space of phylogenetic trees. And these arise in cancer genomics in various frameworks. You can think about taking multiple samples from the same tumor, either sequenced in time, sort of across treatment, or sequenced in space or different sites in the patient. And you can think about multiple samples also from different tumors, either from spatially heterogeneous samples from a single tumor or single patient, or even samples from multiple patients. And in all these cases, you produce a phylogenetic tree from the underlying genomic data. And there's sort of two classes of mathematical problem, broadly speaking, that come up here. One of them is trying to produce the trees in the first place, which is a well-studied and sort of classical problem. And another one is trying to perform inference and analysis once you have the trees. And mostly what I want to do is tell you about tools for the second kind of problem. So I'm going to assume that the trees are produced as given and think about what you can do with that kind of information. So the overview for the talk and sort of the background for this is that there's very celebrated work of Balera, Holmes, and Voigtman, which produces a distance between phylogenetic trees and organizes them into a metric space and demonstrates that you can do certain kinds of geometry, that this distance imposes geometric structure. And what this talk is really about is trying to exploit this for scientifically relevant inference. So there's sort of three directions I want to tell you a little bit about. One of them is something called tree dimensionality reduction, which is joint work with Chiabeni and Rabadon and Zaris. And the idea here is to do traditional dimensionality reduction doesn't work very well in the context of these tree spaces. And the idea here is to do something that preserves tree structures. Another kind of thing I want to tell you about, which is joint work with Blumberg and Walker, is non-parametric distribution testing in tree space, just to tell if two clouds of samples you get come from the same underlying distribution or not, which again is interesting because this is a non-Euclidean space. And the last little bit is to tell you about computing distances, actually trying to compute some of these distances and optimal matching between forests, so between clouds of trees. And so let me go on now and tell you a little bit about the background to get started. So as mathematical background, what we're working with is a metric space. And this just means a set of points and a distance function. It takes a pair of points and gives you a number. And it satisfies a couple of simple axioms. Notably, the distance is 0 only when points coincide. It's symmetric. And maybe most interestingly, the triangle inequality holds, which tells you if you have 3 points, the distance between any two of them is smaller than the sum of the distances along the other legs of the triangle. There are lots of examples of standard Euclidean distance, maybe more relevant distances in genomics sometimes come from correlation distances or Hamming distances. And we're going to put a distance on the space of phylogenetic trees. So I should tell you what the objects are. So what we're working with is a phylogenetic tree on n leaves. And this is going to be a rooted tree with distinguished leaves, which are degree 1, and often a root, which we think of as degree 2, and vertices, internal vertices of degree 3. I'll have a picture if this doesn't mean anything to you. And we think about having weights, so numbers labeling at least the internal edges and maybe the edges connecting to the leaves. One warning, and the picture will make this clear, is that these are not required to be planar trees. So we don't, so there are different ways of drawing pictures of these, and we want to identify all of those. And one key point to mention at the outset is that there are many, many tree topologies. I mean, branching patterns. So if you have n leaves, there are 2 to the n minus 3 factorial branching patterns. And this is an enormous number. This grows very, very fast. And it's this rate of growth that makes some of the mathematical problems interesting or hard. So, and I'll say more about that as we go on. So these are examples of trees, and the part of the point of this illustration is that the green row on the top, these are all the pictures of the same tree, where we've chosen different ways of drawing them, basically. On the bottom, we have actually different branching patterns. So this is an indication of what it means to have the same and different topologies. For the points of this space. Now, the metric space works as follows. So associated to each tree, you have weights on the edges. And this gives you a vector of real numbers. So for any fixed tree topology, you have a point in the positive part of Euclidean space. And you think of this, you can imagine this as a cube, and the idea to build this space is to glue the cubes together, where you identify two tree topologies if I can get them to be to the same place by squeezing edges to zero. Okay, that's what a path looks like in this space, where you move you adjust these weights, and you glue these cubes along what happens when you degenerate. And then the metric is just that within one of these Euclidean spaces, the distance is just a straight line, and the metric in the entire space of glued cubes is sort of the minimal length path. You take the path metric. So what does a tree rotation look like? So this picture represents a path between two trees. So if you look at the gray squares, those two trees are different. They have different branching patterns. And you can get between them if you take the red edges and shrink them to zero. I'm sort of pointing at the screen here, and that's maybe not so helpful. But if you take the red edges and shrink those to zero, you degenerate to a tree now with a degree 4 vertex, which is the same. And so this is a picture of a path in the tree space, a path between those two, or snapshots of a path between those two gray trees. Okay, so now, this is the distance, and the point is that the observation is that distances give you geometry. And in particular, they give you a notion of curvature. And the way so how do you get curvature from distance? You get this by thinking about triangles. So if you think about a triangle, on a flat piece of paper, that should have 180 degrees. If you think about a triangle, a very large triangle on the surface of the Earth, and there's sort of a little picture of this here, it's fatter than you would expect. There's degree excess, and the triangle sort of spreads out at the angles. You could also imagine, and physical examples of this are harder to come by, triangles that are thinner than you would expect in Euclidean space. And so the idea for thinking about the geometry of a metric space is to think about what do triangles look like. If you have 3 vertices, you have 3 line segments, you can take a comparison triangle in Euclidean space, and you can ask, is the triangle in your metric space skinnier or fatter than you would expect in Euclidean space? And if it's thinner, and this is sort of the relevant notion for us, then the word for this is cat 0, or you say non-positively curved. So the sphere is positively curved, something like a hyperbolic space is non-positively curved. And the big theorem of Bolera, Holmes, and Voigtman is that the space of phylogenetic trees is cat 0, is a non-positively curved space. So it looks like that skinny triangle on the far left in the pictures. Okay, so the point of this is the following. So if you think about points on the Earth, if I take antipodal points, there are 2 shortest paths connecting them, right? I can go either way around the world. And if I think about the average of those things, there are 2 very reasonable choices, again, on opposite sides of the globe, for the average. And if I perturb those points with a little bit of noise, I can make the sort of sensible average flip back and forth. It's not a stable thing. So if you're doing statistics, this is terrible, right? This is a disaster, or it makes it hard. The point of a non-positively curved space is precisely that averages behave stably with respect to that kind of perturbation. There's a unique centroid for a collection of points, and that makes it plausible to think about statistical inference. So the good news is that indeed, because the space of phylogenetic trees is non-positively curved, there are certain ways in which it acts like Euclidean space. And notably, you can define what's called a Frechet mean, but this is just a fancy way of saying the centroid. It's just the point that minimizes the distance to all the other points. And there's a notion of variance, which is sort of the ratio of that realized distance. On the other hand, there's bad news, which is that there are a lot of pathological things about this space that make statistical inference challenging. The most salient problem, or maybe the problem from which all others flow, is that the origin is too close to everything. The space is very big, and the origin, which is sort of the star tree where all internal weights are 0, is arbitrarily close to every single one of these 2 to the n minus 3 double factorial cubes. So every tree topology is very close to the origin. And what this means, for instance, is that the central limit theorem behaves in a very surprising way. So this is very nice work of Barden, Lee, and Owens, which tells you that the law of large numbers and the central limit theorem don't act the way you think they do. when you're thinking about computing sort of the empirical mean and how that converges to some mean of a distribution. And it means that parametric distributions are very hard to specify in a sensible way. Anything you write down has very non-intuitive behavior. Nonetheless, when the tree space is low-dimensional, so if there are only a couple of possible branching patterns, it's much easier to visualize and work with. And so this is a picture of work that I did with Kibanian and Zaris and Rabadon. And this is a picture of sequence data that was taken from, I guess it says somewhere on the slide, from glioblastoma. And sequencing was performed, exome sequencing was performed at diagnosis and then at relapse. And you get these little trees, and we plotted these on the tree space. And what you see is that, and without talking about any sort of analysis of this, you can see very clearly that patients treated with TMZ, the points in the space cluster down in the right-hand corner. And we added a sort of annotation for size to indicate the total count of mutations. This is a normalized picture. Now, there are similar analyses that were done in work on distinguishing local tumor data from spatially separated multifocal tumors. And so this is a reasonable tool. But in higher dimensional spaces, it's really hard to know what to do. And so what you always do when you have a high dimensional space is that you try to do dimensionality reduction. And so maybe you embed in Euclidean space for if you have n leaves, you embed in a very small Euclidean space using something like PCA. And here, PCA is a proxy. Of course, there are many kinds of spectral methods or other kinds of ways you could imagine embedding this stuff. All of these perform fairly poorly because of the nonlinearity of tree space. It's very nonlinear, and it has corners. If you think about the gluing of these cubes, if you glue two pieces of paper together in a folded way, it's not a smooth attachment. It's a sharp corner, and these impose serious problems for these things. And there's been some work on this by Holmes and Owens and my student Jill Grindstaff. And the conclusion is that PCA-based solutions or spectral methods and manifold learning kind of techniques work okay in some applications if you're very far from the origin, basically. So if you're in a region that looks kind of like Euclidean space, then these things sort of work okay. But in order to deal with sort of very large trees, and to preserve the tree structure, we worked on a method of dimensionality reduction that tries to preserve the geometric structure. And the idea is straightforward. You have a very big tree, and you subsample the labels of the leaves. And you take little trees that are formed by those leaves and the edges incident to them. And I'll have a picture of this in the next slide. But the broad idea is you have a very large tree, and you turn that into a cloud or a distribution of smaller trees. And this allows for reasonable visualizations and reduces the computational burden of working with this. One of the things I didn't talk about is the algorithmic details of computing the metric in this space are involved. And this improves the behavior of these local embeddings. And there are key theoretical questions about the degree to which you can recover the geometric structure of the large space from details of this cloud of trees. So here's a picture of what this looks like. If you have this sort of large tree in the middle, the different colors represent different subsamples of the labels. And so when you take, say, for instance, just the green tree labels, you get if you keep only the edges incident to those leaves, you get that little tree up in the right-hand corner. And when you draw that in a nice way, it looks like this smaller tree on, I guess, 5 leaves. And the idea would be that you'd summarize this large tree by a large collection of these subsamples. So what you can prove about this, and I'm going to avoid stating theorems, but just tell you what they say, is that this is a stable procedure. If you perturb the large tree a little bit, in a suitable sense, you perturb the sort of forest of little trees you get by a controllable amount. This also, you might wonder how this interacts with the ways one produces these trees in the first place, and this interacts very nicely with neighbor joining, which is a standard metric tree construction method. The story for other sorts of tree production algorithms is more complicated, but reasonable. And one interesting thing is that you can show that if you have enough of these little trees in a generic situation, you can recover the big tree. So in some sense, you haven't lost anything, at least in principle. Okay, so here's an example. This is not from cancer, but from the flu, but illustrates the technique nicely on a very large tree. So these are hemagglutinin sequences, and this is maybe 1,000 samples taken from the flu in New York. And here, you can play the, so one, as described, the tree dimensionality reduction procedure involves just sort of randomly subsampling from the leaves. But of course, if the leaves have labels, either corresponding to spatial information or temporal information, you can use that in your subsampling. And so what we did here was we subsampled according to the little time windows. So we had sort of a sliding window of years, and we subsampled to get random samples from contiguous years and perform the tree dimensionality reduction based on the sliding windows. And if you do this, you get lots of interesting things. And so one of the pictures to show is that this is sort of this pentagram-looking thing is a stylized representation of a high-dimensional tree space. I think this is dimension 5, and the colored points are, and you can see from the key, are different flu season samples or windows, and you can see that, for instance, that seasons in which there was poor vaccine effectiveness are spatially segregated in this tree. And in fact, we were able to make a fairly reasonably performing predictor for vaccine effectiveness based on the dispersion of the cloud of trees produced by the dimensionality reduction. So that brings us sort of to the next thing I want to talk about, which is some of the statistical questions that come up in dealing with these forests of trees. And the sort of basic question here is, if you have 2 forests, and maybe you produced these by this tree dimensionality reduction, for instance, or maybe you got them directly somehow, you can ask, did these come from the same distribution on tree space? And so that's a very basic question. It has various interesting applications. One of them is to comparing the results of this dimensionality reduction procedure. Another is comparing collections of trees you got directly. And a third one is that if you think about maximum likelihood procedures for producing trees, if you, instead of taking the maximum likelihood tree, you think about the entire posterior, you could try to use techniques like what I'm going to describe to compare the output of these tree production algorithms. And for doing these comparisons, the standard sort of things you might do don't work very well, because parametric tests are a problem, because you can't specify, it's hard to write down meaningful distributions. And since the space isn't Euclidean, the sort of standard non-parametric story doesn't work. So what you do instead is you use this observation, now coming back to sort of metric geometry. There's this wonderful observation due to Gromov, which is that if you have any metric space, you can think about the sort of associated space of distance matrices. So what do I mean by this? You take your big metric space that you can sample from. So you have a probability measure on some set with distances, and you take a sample, and now you form a matrix where the entries of the matrix are the pairwise distances between the samples. Okay, that's what this is. And you have an induced distribution now on the set of matrices. And if you think about this as the number of points goes to infinity, the theorem is that this uniquely characterizes the original probability distribution on your space. And so our idea is that you use this to produce a test. And so the test is that you essentially take the empirical centroid of your points, but you take sort of a single row of the distance matrix, and you just look at that as a Euclidean vector. And now you use a standard, your favorite non-parametric distribution test to do a 2-sample test to compare the two samples. So again, to summarize, you have these 2 samples. For each one of them, you compute the distance matrices, which is a matrix of real numbers. You take essentially the row in that corresponds to distances to sort of the most central point, and then you compare the distribution of real numbers you get there. And this turns out to have attractive theoretical properties, but it turns out to be a good test just in terms of its power. And so, for instance, we validated this in part on some of the flu data, and what you can see is that you can detect, these are these distance distributions, and you can detect differences in the distribution of the flu that correspond to times when there was vaccine failure, in part because of change in the genetic profile, and when there wasn't. And this is, I mean, when we first did this work, we did this by just sort of looking at a measure of spread in terms of distance to the centroid. And this is a sort of more sophisticated version of that kind of test. So a related question you can ask is, so one kind of question you can ask about collections of samples is, did they come from the same distribution? Another you can ask is, how different are they? Can I measure the distance between them, and can I match them up in a way that preserves the local relationships between the trees? And for this, we use sort of another, and again, these problems are interesting in large part because we're in some funny metric space, right? We don't have points, despite the pictures, we don't have points that are embedded in Euclidean space. So we don't have sort of the usual geometry of space to help us. We just have these abstract tools. And so there's a very general question of how do you compare points in a metric space? And if they sit inside the same ambient metric space, then there's something called the Hausdorff distance, which basically is a minimax distance. You take, if you want to compare the distance between the blue points and the red points, is you take the worst point in the blue thing, and you take its distance to the closest point in the red thing, and you take the worst point in the red thing, and its closest distance to the blue thing, and you take the min of those two. And a nicer way of saying this, maybe, is that I take the blue points and I blow up balls around them until I've encapsulated all of the red points. And that gives me a number. And I take the red points and I blow up balls around them until I've encapsulated all of the blue points, and that gives me a number, and I take the smaller of those two numbers. So this tells you, this is some measure of how close these things are. Now, that metric is fine if they're both embedded in the same space, maybe, but it's not good, if you just have two samples that aren't embedded in the same space, this doesn't help you very much. And moreover, even if they are embedded in the same space, if I have two circles that are very far apart, they're going to have a large Hausdorff distance because the distances between those circles are big. And that's just not what you want. And so instead we have this notion that's called the Gromov-Hausdorff distance, where the idea is you take the minimum over all possible embeddings into some bigger containing metric space and then take the Hausdorff distance. And another way of thinking about this is you're allowed to do any kind of transformation you want of these points. You can move them around, and you take the best distance you can. So in this sort of Pac-Man picture, there's one embedding on the left, which is very close to the given one. There's one on the right, and then the one on the right, that's sort of the Hausdorff distance, is going to be much smaller, and you take the min over all of these. You take the best possible way of doing this. And this turns out to be a metric and to have lots of good properties. But one issue with it is that it's impossible to compute. And, just to give you a flavor of what these things look like, this is, this expression is telling you sort of that one way of approximating this is a sort of minimax problem over all possible ways of matching up the points. So R stands for a correspondence, which is just a matching, basically. And what this is saying is if you take sort of a minimax over the worst distance in all the matchings, that's an expression for the Hausdorff metric. And I put this up mostly not because it's so important that you know this formula, but because this gives you an indication of the kinds of computational tools, if you know these sorts of things, that you might use to attack this. And so we can't compute this directly, but we can relax. And by relax, I just mean instead of trying to find the minimax, you try to minimize a sum. So turn that soup into a sum, for instance. And this is a very standard kind of thing in dealing with expressions like this. And if you can, one sort of relaxation you do, maybe the first one leads you to an optimal transport problem, sort of an earth mover distance kind of problem. And these are well studied, but they're hard to compute. They turn out the sort of technical word for what you get is a quadratic program. And while there are algorithms to deal with quadratic programs, they don't have very attractive complexity properties. And so the record in terms of dealing with this sort of thing is maybe 35 or 40 points. For at least for this specific problem. These numbers get better every day, but still, we're not talking about a lot of points. So the work I did with Ward and Bandera and Villar was to study a semi-definite programming relaxation. And semi-definite programming is a convex optimization technique for which there are polynomial time algorithms that are significantly better than quadratic programming. And so one of the kinds of things you do with this, so maybe before I say that, so we studied this semi-definite programming relaxation, and this had sort of two interesting properties. One of them is that it's efficient, and so we can do hundreds of points, and I think with better approximation techniques, maybe thousands. But another thing is that it turns out that this semi-definite programming relaxation itself gives you a metric. So it gives you a distance that satisfies the triangle inequality, which is intrinsically interesting. And I think there's sort of further stuff to say about that, although I think maybe I won't today. So one of the kinds of things that you do with this, and where this literature came from, is the image literature, where people are dealing with what they call point registration for surfaces. So what these pictures are representing is that you take a mesh. We took meshes for people, horses, and dogs, and took randomly sampled landmark points, and then used this optimization problem to match them, to compute a distance, but also to think about the matching that produced that distance. And if you do this, you can see that what's happening is this preserves local relationships. And so, the head more or less goes to the head in terms of this correspondence. And so in image processing, this is used for for hoping that sort of if you maintain the local distance relationships, you maintain some kind of functional relationship in the surface in question. And you can do the same thing in trees. And so there's sort of work in progress to use this to match up forests of trees, in particular using the data coming from these sort of spatially heterogeneous tumors versus local tumors. Okay, and so that's sort of the talk, but let me just summarize. So the things, there's lots of machinery here that makes this sort of hard to assimilate if you haven't thought about this before, but sort of the summary message is that there's this useful mathematical abstraction in terms of the space, this metric space of phylogenetic trees that has geometry. And we already have indications that this is useful in cancer genomics, and I think there'll be more. And we're developing reasonable mathematical tools for solving the sort of natural kinds of statistical and inference problems that come up in this context, and that are computationally tractable, so that they could be used on real data sets. And this is a list of the various papers that I was rapidly summarizing in the talk, and I'd also like to acknowledge my various students who've helped with this work, notably Jill Grindstaff, Chris Kennedy, Riley Meth, and Therese Wu. And this work is supported by the NIH, in particular this Cancer Center, and also by grants from AFOSR. And that's it.
You alluded to the computational, algorithm side of this. Is there a suite of tools that I can go and play with?
Suite of tools might be overselling it, but there's publicly available code that I can send you.
Yeah, so, I wasn't thinking of me because I'm this, but I meant in general. Yeah.
Hence my hedging.
Yeah. All right.
Yes. So do any of these, results or framework generalize to spaces of graphs? So
yes.
Trees?
Yeah, absolutely.
And then you were mentioning subtrees, so like, for example, identifying frequent subgraphs or motifs or graph motifs. Mm-hmm. What's the latest and greatest?
I mean, all of this stuff works very generally. So if you have a suitable notion of graph distance, you can apply this. And in fact, this is very closely related to these notion of graph-on distances and things like this. So I think the high-level answer is absolutely. I haven't done so much work on that, and so I don't have anything very specific to say. But yeah, that fits into this framework nicely.
Yeah, there are some people here have been thinking also about the space of graphs and generalizations of these kind of spaces when you start adding kind of cycles and all these different things the whole thing. So they are very interesting work also. Yes, sir.
Is the solution that you find for the optimization problem, can you guarantee that it's a global solution, or you might get stuck in local minimum?
So it's a convex optimization problem. So you can guarantee that the result of the SDP the semi-definite programming relaxation is global. Now, there's another question, which is how well does this relaxation capture the problem you're actually trying to solve? And there, it's harder to come up with guarantees. I think the thing I can say is that for things, it's sort of what you would expect, sort of for clouds that are close together, then the answer we get is the global optimum, basically. And for things that are very far apart, what we get might be further from the actual distance. But it's not that's one of the really attractive things about this is that and to emphasize, this is a convex optimization problem. It has a solution, and that solution is optimal. You know, it's a generalization of linear programming.
You made a comment about if you had enough small trees, you could reconstruct the big one. That, of course, was one of the basic methods for constructing trees donkeys years ago with quartet puzzling. Mm-hmm. Does the quartet puzzling methodology fit directly into this?
Yeah.
It shows that it works and da-da-da.
That's right.
Yes.
So at least for the optimal mass transfer, like if you use some kind of a regularization like SYMPOSIUM and others, it's shown that it's kind of unstable, and that's one of the bigger problems to deal with. And perhaps.
Yeah. So that's. What to say, early indications are that this is somewhat more stable, but also has there are stability issues. So I think I would affirm your concern about that.
Talking about relaxations, I wonder if you can, now that you have a point cloud, can you try to relax the matrix of the space and maybe consider them as a standard point cloud and compare the distributions, like peer divergence things? I wonder if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, so the way I would interpret that, you mean something like embedded, take an embedding in Euclidean space, where you, yeah. So one thing you can do with these point clouds is there's an enormous literature on the computer science literature on optimal embeddings of finite metric spaces, so point clouds into low distortion embeddings into things like Euclidean spaces where you might use standard statistical tools. You can also do that. Again, I don't have any theory to say about this. The sort of computational experiments suggest that you do less well if you do that, but you can definitely do it, and it's a viable. I think that's a viable approach.